Gonzaga reportedly reached out to a young Italian guard in the transfer portal. Could he be the defensive stopper and developmental piece the team needs to complete the roster puzzle?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Folks, I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or the Google Play Store. Well, we have our first scholarship player from Gonzaga entering the transfer portal in Pavle Stosic. We're going to talk about that, what it means for Gonzaga's roster. We're also going to talk about the Zags in the NBA. The playoffs have been dominated by former Gonzaga players. We'll get to that to close out the show. But first, we are talking about Tarleton State transfer Emmanuel Innocenti. And I'm going to give you guys a little bit of just a peek behind the curtains, as it were. So I've been planning for Friday's show to be a transfer profile, talking about somebody in the transfer portal that Gonzaga has some connection to, whether they've reached out to them, it's reported they've reached out, it's a player that we know that they recruited previously, whatever it may be. And there's a handful of options. And I even went to the Discord channel, which, by the way, if you want this kind of access, join the Discord channel. It is free. There's a link in the show notes. I asked them to give me their thoughts on a select group of players that we could potentially talk about for the show. Ultimately decided to push back recording the show, in part because I had some other work and family stuff going on. And I'm glad that I did, in part because Pavle Stosic entered the transfer portal on Friday morning, so we get to talk about that rather than having to wait until next week. But the reason I was hesitant to talk about some of the other transfers on the list was a lot of them I didn't feel like really were logical fits for Gonzaga's roster next season. There was Trezarian White. We may end up talking about him at some point, from UNC Wilmington, 20-point per game scorer. A guy from Wilmington. He's a senior, 6'6". He's just a lot like Michael Ajayi, and I don't see Gonzaga adding another player who wants the ball in his hands, who wants to kind of have his final year of college basketball be playing at a high level to try to move into the NBA conversation. There's a spot for a player like that on Gonzaga's roster, and Michael Ajayi took it. Like, it already has been filled. So I don't see that fit making a lot of sense unless somebody else leaves. Cason Pryor from South Florida is another player who I think we've seen Gonzaga connected to. He began his career at Boise State. So there's a connection there with Leon Rice, but he's a senior looking for the same thing, an opportunity to play big minutes and boost his NBA draft profile. That doesn't feel like it happens here at Gonzaga with the way the roster is currently constructed. So I kind of hemmed and I hawed, and I decided I'm not sure I find a player suitable right now. But then late on Friday night, there was a tweet that came out that indicated that Gonzaga has one of the schools that has reached out to Tarleton State transfer Emmanuel Innocenti. And that's the direction we're going, because I think this makes a lot more sense roster construction-wise than some of the other players that have been connected to Gonzaga so far in the transfer portal. A little bit about Innocenti. He's a 6'5" wing from Italy. He's born and raised in Italy. He played high school basketball in Italy. He was not ranked on On3 or 24/7 Sports, but they don't typically rank international prospects, so that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. Obviously, he ended up going to Tarleton State, so didn't exactly end up at a huge marquee program or anything like that, but he played a big role as a freshman last year for Tarleton State in the WAC. Played 35 games, started 33 of them, and played 32 minutes a night. Day one starter, big time contributor right away for this. And this is a good program, by the way. Tarleton State, it's not a name that people hear a whole lot. Billy Gillespie, the head coach there, he took off most of last year with some heart stuff. Unfortunately, we hope he's okay. But of course, the former Kentucky coach, so he certainly has an ability to recognize some talent for this Texans program. But I think the main thing here is looking at the stats, is the impact he had defensively, because he doesn't jump off the page offensively. In 32 minutes per game for Tarleton State, he averaged about 6.5 points per game, but he also averaged 6.5 rebounds per game. He also averaged just under 3 assists per game, and he averaged 1.7 steals per game. The offensive efficiency was fairly subpar. about 47% on 2-point shots. That's about 3.5 2-point shot attempts per game. Just under 31% from three. That's a little over 2 3-point attempts per game. So not a high volume shooter at all. I mean, again, playing 32 minutes a game and only scoring about 7 points, it's pretty clear he wasn't a guy who was taking a lot of shots for this Tarleton team. He did shoot 80% from the free throw line, 44 for 55. So again, fairly small sample, but if you were looking for players who you think could develop offensively, particularly as 3-point shooters, free throw percentage is a really valuable way to look at that. It's how NBA scouts analyze guys who they are projecting to potentially be better 3-point shooters at the next level. It's also something that's going to hurt Anton Watson for that exact same reason, as he looks to be an NBA player as well. But regardless, if you see that 30.8% three-point rate for Innocenti, and you're thinking, oh, he's not going to develop into a 3-point shooter, those of you who are longtime listeners, you know what I'm about to say. You've heard this phrase before, Ryan Woolridge effect. Basically, what I mean by that is when you go from an offense where there's maybe it's maybe less spread out and there's more attention on each individual player. You go to an offense like Gonzaga's where you're the fifth option offensively, you might get more open looks. Now, Innocenti wasn't a high volume shooter, so the Woolridge effect doesn't quite apply here as much as it typically does. But I do think that if he were to come to Gonzaga, that 3-point percentage would very likely bump up. Does he become elite? Hard to say. He's a freshman, so certainly some development could come, but hard to say if that's ever going to be a huge part of his game. But again, the appeal here is the defense. It's the size and the defense. He's 6'5". He's a little under 200 pounds. He's a decently sized kid who's got some room to grow. He was 4th in the WAC last year in steals per game. He was 3rd in total steals. He was also 5th in defensive win shares, 6th in steal percentage, and 10th in defensive blocks plus minus. Effectively, he was one of the 10 best defensive players in the entire Western Athletic Conference last year. That's the appeal. A true freshman who has 3 years of eligibility remaining, who is a big guard, who was one of the best defensive players in a decent basketball conference last year. That's the sales pitch. That's my sales pitch to you, dear listeners, about why Innocenti makes sense for that final roster spot for Gonzaga. Now, there are a lot of other schools interested. We don't know the full list. It was not entirely posted. Again, I caution that seeing a list that says heard from could mean a lot of different things, and that could be the case here with Gonzaga. But the other schools on this list alongside Gonzaga are St. Mary's, Grand Canyon, St. Bonaventure, and New Mexico State. We know St. Mary's loves their defensive prospects. We know they have a lot of room to fill spots with Mahaney gone, with Jefferson gone, with a handful of other guys gone, with some incoming recruits who've already decommitted. Randy Bennett's got room. He loves defensive prospects. He's dipped into the international market quite a bit, mostly in Australia, but that doesn't mean he can't do it here. So they are definitely a major player here for Innocenti. So if nothing else, if he doesn't end up going to Gonzaga, but he goes to St. Mary's, at least now you got a chance to learn about their newest player next year. Grand Canyon has been scooping up transfers left and right. They've also scooped up a handful of transfers from the WAC already. So that certainly is a possible destination. St. Bonaventure has been very active in the transfer portal the last couple of years. New Mexico State certainly has some room to grow after their debacle the last 2 years. Their move to Conference USA, they were a little better this year, but still some room to grow. Jason Hooten, though, very solid coach over there. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the fit at Gonzaga, because I'm sold, and I'm trying to sell you all on why I think this makes sense. But the reason that I didn't talk about Trezarian White, the reason I didn't talk about Cason Pryor, is because, again, Gonzaga has a finite amount of scholarships available. They're probably not going to fill all of them. Stosic leaving gives them 3 scholarships right now. They, of course, already replaced Colby Brooks, the walk-on, with Kate Orness, another walk-on, so they filled a spot there. But ultimately, I think if you're Gonzaga right now, the odds of landing a senior who's going to come in for just 1 year without a promise of much playing time, it seems unlikely. We've talked about the Geno Crandall or the Aaron Cook as being the final roster spot, that 3rd, 4th guard, a veteran point guard who can come in, kind of calm everything down. You kind of know what you're getting with them. They're reliable, consistent, etc. Gonzaga, A, doesn't really have room for that, and B, they don't really need it. Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman are both capable point guards. They're both going to be seniors next year. Like, that's just not as big of a need on this roster. I think a younger guard is a bigger need. I don't think there's a huge need in the front court. If there was, Pavle Stosic wouldn't be leaving. They just don't have a lot of playing time in the front court right now. I think that the front court additions come a little bit later in the process. They're not focused on that right now. And with Graham Ike and Ben Gregg and Braden Huff and Jun-Suk Yo and Michael Ajayi potentially able to play the small ball 4 role, you just don't need it. You just don't need it. So the need to me is a young guard who's willing to develop in the system, which you have to just take a player on their word. If you're recruiting them and you say, hey, this is kind of the vision we have for you. It's a 2-year plan. It's a 3-year plan, whatever it may be. That to me is the biggest, is the best way Gonzaga could fill out the rest of this roster, because the playing time in the backcourt is not necessarily going to be huge in year one. Innocenti played 32 minutes a game last year at Tarleton State. He's playing less than half that if he comes to Gonzaga. It's not going to be there, barring, of course, an injury or a very late transfer portal addition, which seems quite unlikely. By the way, the portal officially closes May 1st, next Wednesday. Nobody's entering the transfer portal after that. So we'll see if there's any more movement between now and then, although I think it's fairly unlikely. But Innocenti could come to Gonzaga, play a small role, compete with Luka Krajinovic for third guard minutes. Again, his assist numbers indicate he could be kind of somebody they could use at that point guard spot. They don't need to force him into a point guard role right now because they have Nembhard, they have Hickman, they have Krajinovic, all those guys who are capable of playing the 1. So he can kind of settle into playing more of the 2. He'll compete with Steele Venters and Dusty Stromer for minutes there. He likely won't pass those guys for minutes, likely won't pass Krajinovic for minutes. So he's probably in that 10, 12 minutes per game, more against bad teams, less against good teams kind of situation. He's going to have to buy into being willing to take on that role, and he may not be, in which case you tip your cap and you say good luck, because you just can't, you're not going to make a false promise to somebody. You're going to tell them exactly what the situation is. But part of that situation is next year, you could be in line for a huge role, and you'll have had you'll have learned the system. So if you're competing with minutes for, an Isaiah Harwell, who it's maybe a bad example because Isaiah Harwell is pretty obviously going to start and play right away if he commits to Gonzaga in that 2025 class. But you then can say, hey, you're playing alongside him. You're playing a valuable role right away. And because you're familiar with the system, you learn from guys like Nembhard and Hickman and Michael Ajayi and everybody else who's going to be out the door after next year. We think you're ready to step in and play a big role right away. Again, that sales pitch is, to me, pretty compelling. And it's more compelling than I think the sales pitch he might hear at some other places, even if they can promise him more immediate playing time. But it depends what he wants. I think there's a sales pitch there. I think there's an argument to him that makes sense for his long-term development as a college basketball player and potential future pro basketball player to come to Gonzaga. And I think the argument for why Gonzaga should add him is fairly obvious. We will see if anything comes of this. I'd rather talk about players like this who maybe aren't as big names as somebody like Trazarian White or Kason Pryor, but who I think are more logical fits for Gonzaga's roster as it is currently constructed, because that's what matters the most. Adding talent is great, but constructing a roster in a way that works the best is what Gonzaga needs to be focusing on. And I think Gonzaga's interest here proves that that's what they're trying to do. Well, we talked a little bit about Pavle Stosic. He becomes the first scholarship player to enter the transfer portal out of Gonzaga. What does it mean for Mark Few's team? We're going to talk more about that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience, that's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags. We're still talking transfer portal because Pavle Stosic becomes the second Gonzaga player and the first player on scholarship to officially enter the transfer portal, likely concluding his short career as a Gonzaga Bulldog. Again, Colby Brooks officially entered the transfer portal last week. He was a walk-on at Gonzaga for the last couple of years. He's already drawn Division I attention, but mind you, which I think is very cool. Hopefully he does end up staying at the Division I level. And now Stosic follows suit. Like I said, Wednesday, May 1st is the deadline to enter the NCAA transfer portal. So if there is going to be any other movement, it's going to happen in the next 5 days or so. Stosic is not a huge surprise here. I talked about how I don't think there's going to be much more roster change, roster movement. And if you told me that there was going to be one more player entering the portal, I probably would have guessed Stosic because he just didn't play very much last year. And he was an incredibly late recruit to the team. So he got here in like late September, I believe that he committed to Gonzaga on my birthday, which is September 23rd, because I was out of town celebrating my birthday, thinking it's late September. This is like the least busy news time for college basketball ever. And here I am having to film a 1-minute video recording about how we added a new player to the roster. It was insanity last offseason. This addition of Stosic was in part response to a lot of late roster changes that happened for Gonzaga. Alex Tui, a longtime commit to join the team, decided he was going to stay and play professionally in Australia instead. Marcus Adams Jr. decommitted from Kansas, entered the transfer portal out of Kansas because he'd been enrolled in classes, came to Gonzaga for like a month and then entered the transfer portal again, ended up at BYU, has entered the transfer portal since then as well, by the way. So Zags lost Tui. They lost Marcus Adams Jr., who they never really had in the first place. Caden Perry, unfortunately, had his medical redshirt, unfortunately decided to end his playing career because of multiple injuries. That was a really devastating thing to see. And so having Perry out the door, Tui out the door, Adams Jr. out the door, the Zags were just desperate to find somebody to fill a roster spot, to put on scholarship, to have as a developmental piece for the future. And the player they ended up landing on was Stosic. He had played with the Serbian U18 team in FIBA tournaments. He'd averaged 6.5 points and about 4 boards. He'd played professionally overseas. Gonzaga said, okay, let's bring this guy over. Let's see what kind of development we can do for him in a freshman season. And he didn't play much. He played 46 total minutes. It's 15 less minutes than Joe Few played last year. He didn't get a lot of playing time on the floor. He finished his first season, his only season in Spokane, with 14 points and 11 rebounds. Just not a big time player for this team in year one. And his decision to enter the transfer portal has less to do with that and more to do with there wasn't going to be playing time going forward either. And I don't blame him I don't know what the conversation with the coaching staff was, but when you do exit interviews, you do, end of the season conversations, I suspect that there wasn't a lot of promise of playing time in the immediate future for him either. Because again, Graham Ike is still here. Ben Gregg is still here. Braden Huff is still here. Anton Watson's no longer here, but Michael Ajayi steps into a similar-ish role. Jun-Suk Yo can also play some backup 4 minutes potentially. Stosic is behind all of those guys in the front court depth chart. And so next year, the immediate upcoming season, the odds of him playing a whole lot more than just pure garbage time minutes like he did last year are pretty slim. Most guys don't want to spend 2 years playing almost no minutes. The problem here is that if you are willing to spend 2 years playing very little minutes, you're at least hoping that there's a pretty good chance you're going to play big minutes in year 3. And honestly, they couldn't even really guarantee that. Because Graham Ike can still be here. Braden Huff can still be here. Ben Gregg will be gone. Michael Ajayi will be gone. But those 2 guys will still be here. Yo, I believe, could potentially still be here as a senior as well. And of course, the Gonzaga is going to navigate the transfer portal. They're going to navigate recruits as well. So best case for Stosic in year 3 was maybe being the 3rd big, unless he had a huge developmental jump this upcoming season. I can understand not wanting to be on the bench for pretty much guaranteed 3 years. Especially in the modern era where it's so easy to jump to a new school and find somewhere else to go. So I don't blame Pavle at all. I imagine the coaching staff was very honest with him about, hey, we're not sure we see a huge growth or an increase in playing time, I should say, as a sophomore. Obviously, if you work hard, if you keep improving in these areas, we'll try to get you more minutes. But I think they were honest with him, and I think he decided, hey, I'd rather explore my options, whether that means going to another Division I school, whether that means going back home to pursue a professional career in Serbia if he wants to do that. Plenty of options. You only give yourself those options if you enter the transfer portal. He could, in theory, return. I don't think that he's going to, but again, entering the transfer portal does not preclude you from returning to the school you were at previously. Gonzaga goes from having 2 open scholarships to 3, and I don't think they're going to fill all of them. So if he'd wanted to come back, that could be an option as well. Again, I think that's fairly likely. I think we'll see him ending up at a lower mid-major program going forward, and hopefully a spot where he can develop, where he can get more playing time, and he can kind of reach the threshold and that potential that we think is certainly there for him. I have nothing but respect for Pavle. Best of luck to him going forward. And I also 100% understand the decision to enter the transfer portal here. We're going to switch gears to close out the show today, talking about the Zags and the NBA, because Chet, Jalen, and Andrew are dominating this week in the NBA playoffs. Although last year's Gonzaga playoff hero, he's kind of struggling. We got more coming up on that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor, Monopoly Go. I've been told, folks, that I have a competitive side. And it's true, I do. I have a competitive side like we all do, and my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. It has been downloaded over 150 million times. It is a great twist on Monopoly where you play on not one, but hundreds of different Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part is getting to mess with my friends. I can charge them rent on my iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly, but now I can also rob their vaults of riches for myself. And the leaderboards show me who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You can team up with friends and people all around the world in timed tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get in the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or the Google Play Store. All right, folks, closing out the show and the week, talking Zags in the NBA playoffs. 4 of Gonzaga's NBA players are in the NBA playoffs as we record right now. That would be Andrew Nembhard with the Indiana Pacers, Chet Holmgren with the Oklahoma City Thunder, Jalen Suggs with the Orlando Magic, and Rui Hachimura with the Los Angeles Lakers. And in a 3-day span, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, a Gonzaga alumni dropped 20 points in an NBA playoff game. 3 days in a row that happened. We'll start with Tuesday. Tuesday was Andrew Nembhard's turn. For the Indiana Pacers in Game 2 against the Milwaukee Bucks, Andrew Nembhard dropped 20 points on 8 of 11 shooting. He had 4 rebounds, 3 assists, and 0 turnovers to help lead Indiana to a Game 2 victory, tied the series 1-1 against Milwaukee. Now, Nembhard struggled in Game 1. He had just 6 points and 3 assists in that first game. He was a minus 15 in the box score plus minus, in part because Indiana kept trying to chase Damian Lillard around screens. I don't know why. That was the defensive strategy against a very, very good clutch three-point shooter in Damian Lillard, but they kept having Andrew chase him around screens up top. Dame just kept drilling 3 after 3 after 3. I think he had like 35 points in the first half, 35 points in the first half of his first game as in the NBA playoffs with the Milwaukee Bucks. But again, Indiana made some adjustments, came out in the second game. Nembhard goes out with a 20-burger on an incredibly efficient 8 of 11 shooting to tie that series up. Love seeing him develop and blossom before our eyes, especially in a high-pressure situation with the Pacers. And then there's Chet. Wow, Chet Holmgren. What an incredible start to his NBA playoff career. Not that we are even remotely surprised by that. So Nembhard drops 20 on Tuesday. Chet on Wednesday, 26 points, 9 of 13 shooting. He has 7 boards and 2 blocks as well. Leads the Thunder to a victory over the Pelicans. They now have a 2-0 lead in that series against New Orleans. And Chet was great in Game 1 as well. His first ever NBA playoff game, had 15 points, 11 boards, and 5 blocks. You know how many rookies have done that in the NBA playoffs in their first game? None. First one. Incredible stuff from Chet. His first half in that second game where he finished with 26 points was otherworldly. He was 9 of 9, I believe, at one point. At least for sure he was 6 of 6 from the field at one point, 3 of 3 from deep. Just absolute dominance from him. New Orleans had no idea how to stop him defensively. He has been an absolute menace really this entire year. His efficiency numbers, his defensive numbers, just incredible stuff from Chet Holmgren. To see him shining on the game's biggest stage is just an incredible joy, especially after he missed his entire rookie season with that foot injury. For him to be back and healthy to play all 82 games in the regular season and now put up back-to-back phenomenal first 2 games in the NBA playoffs. Really fun stuff from him. And then there's Jalen Suggs on Thursday. Again, Nembhard has 20 on Tuesday. Chet has 26 on Wednesday. Suggs drops 24 on Thursday. And believe it or not, Nembhard was 8 of 11. Chet was 9 of 13. Would you believe that Jalen had a better field goal percentage than both of them? He did. 9 of 11 from the field for Suggs, 4 boards, 3 assists, and a pair of steals as well. Orlando is down 1-2, 2 games to 1 in that series against the Cleveland Cavaliers. Suggs had 13 and 4 in the first game. He had 9, 6, and 5 in game 2, but he did suffer what looked like a really bad injury. For those of you who listened to all the shows this week, I talked about it on either Wednesday or Thursday's show, basically said, oh, looks like Jalen Suggs got hurt, recording before we get an update. Hopefully it's not anything super serious. By the time I was done with the show, he'd already returned to the game. So he was fine. And then clearly he turned around, drops 24 points on 9 of 11 shooting. Everything's okay with Jalen Suggs. He's throwing down windmill dunks on breakaways. He's cutting to the basket and dunking all over dudes. Like, it has just been an incredible performance from Jalen Suggs as well. To see Jalen and Chet, 2 guys who were teammates in high school, both shining on this stage. And Andrew, of course, who played with both of them, who's had a incredibly successful career as a second-round pick. It's beautiful to see. And it's renewed my interest in the NBA playoffs. I'm a Portland Trailblazers fan, so I haven't had a lot of excitement to watch in NBA basketball after the college basketball season's over, because the Blazers season is usually over right around then as well, at least the last couple of years. But now to get a chance to see these guys all having this kind of incredible success in the playoffs has been fantastic. And I do wish that our 4th Gonzaga player in the NBA was having that same success, but he is not. However, Rui had a lot of success last year in the playoffs. For those of you who remember this, he had 4 20-plus point games with the Los Angeles Lakers in the 2023 playoffs. He'd been traded to the Lakers from the Washington Wizards at midseason, had finally kind of started to adjust and find his role with the Lakers, and then exploded. He became the first Lakers player since Magic Johnson to have back-to-back 20-point games off the bench in the NBA playoffs. Really nice success from him. And then this year, it hasn't been the same. Has not been the same. The Lakers have been struggling. He's got averaging 5 points per game. He's shooting 33% from the field. He's shooting 33% from 3. He's got 2 assists and 2 turnovers, just not really getting it done for the Lakers right now. It's not entirely his fault. Certainly this team's success and failures don't fall on Rui Hachimura. They fall mostly on Coach Darvin Ham, as well as, of course, LeBron James and Anthony Davis. But it's not fun to see Rui struggling. We know that he's very hard on himself mentally. We know that's been an issue for him in the past. I'm very glad that he had so much success last year in the playoffs, although I imagine that knowing he had that kind of success and not being able to replicate it this year has probably been very hard on him. I'm sure it's hard on Laker fans who are hoping to see more from him during the playoffs, but it is what it is. 3 Zags having phenomenal runs right now in the first round of the NBA playoffs. Hopefully Rui will find his place. He'll have a huge game 4, game 3, game 5, whatever, and just kind of turn everybody's heads and be like, oh, that's right. Rui's capable of hanging 25 on somebody. And now's the time when they need him to do it. Would be really cool to see him get that opportunity and shine, because so far in his first couple games in the playoffs, he hasn't been that guy. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much for sticking with me on this delayed Friday afternoon show, folks. Hope you enjoy your weekend. We will be back next week with Mailbag. We'll continue our season in review series. We'll talk about any late transfer portal changes if we see any of those. All that coming up next week here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic weekend. And as always, go Zags.